Mountain Geology. Join us on Main Street, Wyoming for the story of Dr. David Love.
She's just an absolutely beautiful bird.
The rainy season mist, yellow blossoms never touched by yellow.
Dr. Love, you and your brother were very close in age. Your sister was born much later, but you were the only children in 1,000 square miles. Can you tell me what that was like when you were growing up?
You have to imagine that your world was populated by cowboys and no children, no women. No radio, no television, no music. You had to develop other resources. Our house was lined with books. Our Bible was the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, but we had 1,000 other books, several thousand, in fact. And Mother had been a Latin and Greek scholar, and we had many books in Latin and Greek, which of course we couldn't read, others in French, others in German. Mother tried to teach us some French and some German, but she despaired of Latin and Greek.
Your mother was your primary teacher when you were growing up. What subjects did she teach?
She taught all subjects. We had no schoolhouse. We had the school in the living room of the ranch house, and it was unheated. The fireplace did not work, and there was no stove there, no central heating. So we had to be bundled up pretty much in the wintertime, but it was off from the dining room, which was always, and the kitchen, which were the most populous places in this huge ranch house. So we were alone enough so that we could concentrate and get things done.
Where you lived, there weren't any trees. I mean, there were just rocks. Can you describe for me your first interest in geology?
My first memories go way back. Mother had LeConte's Field Geology, which was a book about that thick. It was written in the 1870s, and it opened windows to a whole other world for us, and both of plants and animals and rocks and earth history. And it was fascinating to us. We could see rocks. Some of them were flat, some of them were folded, some were red, some were candy-striped badlands. And when you have very little else to keep your mind occupied, if you were riding, for example, for 10, 12 hours behind a bunch of cattle, the scene is not very inspiring, but when you look off at these rocks and you wonder why they're there, if you look at other places where there's rich grass, other places where there's no grass, other places where there are bog holes, swampy areas in which we as children could dig and pull out both modern and prehistoric bison skulls, and Indian artifacts made of certain kinds of rocks, always pretty rocks. And those were the things that captivated my interest.
Your mother wrote of your unusual ability to detect arrowheads. What do you attribute that to?
It's not that my vision was any better. It was because I was much closer to the ground and I could see things from a different perspective.
Being the youngest. Oh. By the time you were in high school, though, you went into town, into Lander with your mother, finished high school there, then went to the University of Wyoming, where you obtained both your bachelor's and your master's. But after that, you decided to go back east. You went to Yale to get your PhD. Can you remember that? What did you think, this young man from Wyoming?
When I got my master's degree, it was in the depth of the Depression. I was lucky to get a job at $30 a month. And after a year of working as both as a consultant when there were jobs available or for the Wyoming Geological Survey, I made $60 a month. And I could see that the future was going to require something else. So I applied for graduate work at Columbia and at Yale. Columbia put me on standby. Yale said, come ahead. They gave me $350 a year scholarship, and that was a big scholarship. I thought I could make it on that, so I went back there. And they gave me a scholarship each year for 3 years, and that's how I got through. Going back there was in one sense traumatic, in another sense these were golden years, the golden years of my life. I learned so much from so many people about so many things that those were and will always, in my mind, be the golden years.
But it was as a graduate student that you were first invited to speak to the Geological Society of America. That was unusual for a graduate student.
I was imbued with absolute terror. I wanted out 1,000 times, but I went ahead and did it. And I was so unglued, being dressed up in a suit with suspenders, and I forgot to fasten the suspenders. So I was up there and giving this world-famous speech with my suspenders hanging down.
Well, how did they react? Graduate students do not ordinarily address this group.
No. So I realized I was privileged, and this was special. And rather than it being a case of humiliation, it became a case for much laughter and goodwill.
What about the contents of your actual talk?
The contents were about the Absaroka Range, which we can see from this interview spot. And up until that time, people knew nothing about the Absaroka Range. And theoretically, all the rocks were horizontal. And all the younger rocks were horizontal. And I had found that many of them were not, that some were folded over others, just like a deck of cards being shifted. And that I could date them, and that introduced a whole new concept of timing of the last of the Laramide Revolution, which was the big mountain building revolution that affected western United States.
Well, you had many revolutionary insights with regard to geology, but when you finished with your PhD, you went to work for Shell Oil Company. What happened there? Because you didn't stay with them very long.
As soon as I got my PhD, I was offered a job as a rodman with the U.S. Geological Survey. It was a temporary job with no perks, no expenses, $150 a month. And I thought I was pretty good, and I deserved a lot better than that. But one of my esteemed advisors at Yale said, "Take it. Let's get your foot in the door." So I took it, and I went out to Utah and lived in Provo and worked in the Wasatch Mountains. I never worked any harder in my life than that work, but it was only for 5 months, and then it was over. So I was out of a job, and some years before, a geologist with Shell Oil Company said, "Whenever you want a job, call me." So I called him, and he said, "Take the first train out to Centralia, Illinois," which was a boom town. They had just struck oil there. And for 5 years, I worked for Shell in boom country: Illinois, Michigan, Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And those were great years because they were good to me. They paid me well. They supported my work. I had no complaints at all, except that the wonderful discoveries I had made and was continuing to make and foreseeing in the future, everything went into a locked file and never came out, and it never has. And I couldn't see a professional life that was frustrated by a locked file case. And that was the reason for leaving Shell, taking a 60% cut in salary and going back to the USGS on a permanent basis. It was during World War II, and we were sending planes and tanks and battleships into combat without any armor plate. The Germans had cut off the source of vanadium for vanadium steel, and we had none. So it was a desperate time, and I was assigned to prospect for and find vanadium, to set up mines, and to determine volumes of ore and the grade of ore that could be mined, and to find salt and sulfur that were needed for the processing of vanadium. We had known before the war that there was some uranium in the Phosphoria Formation, where the phosphate beds are in Wyoming and Idaho. And so I was sent out there to first-hand trench the exposures of the Phosphoria, collect samples to analyze them in the field, and then to locate 8 mines. And we located the mines southeast of Afton in the mountains.
One of your major accomplishments is the development of the theories of how Jackson Hole and the Tetons were created. Why did you start with that area? Why did you focus on the Tetons?
First of all, it's beautiful country.
I know they're beautiful. but what was it about the geology?
Beneath that facade of beauty, it is without doubt, at least in my mind, the most complete geologic record from the beginning of Earth history up to the present time. Now, that's saying a lot. When you look at the Grand Canyon, you think there's a lot of history there, but that's only part of it. In the Teton Jackson Hole country, there has been constant crustal activity of the Earth, especially in the last 100 million years. The seas had withdrawn and mountains were pushed up, and then they were buried with debris, and then the debris on both sides went down and was preserved, and the mountains went up further, and volcanism occurred in Yellowstone and went on for perhaps 60 million years, and is almost going on now. So it's an area of great crustal unrest, and with each spasm of unrest, there is a record preserved in some of the rocks in the area.
I remember as a young girl growing up in Wyoming, there was a phenomenon of people running around with Geiger counters. Apparently you had something to do with that?
I was asked to step in whenever there was a crisis of some kind and they needed something. This time it happened to be uranium. This was my involvement began during the war because there was uranium in the vanadium in the Phosphoria Formation. And so we knew about it. And when the uranium boom started, it was all down in Colorado and Utah, and later it spread to New Mexico and to Wyoming. But in Wyoming, we knew there was some uranium because the cook in a sheep camp in the Red Desert country had found this strange yellow mineral, and she had sent it into a mineralogist, and he named it dacite. And so we knew that there had been some uranium, and the Silver Cliff mine at Lusk had been a silver mine many, many years ago. It was now abandoned. So we knew a little bit there was uranium, but the people who were handling the money and the projects said that the uranium had to be related to volcanic rocks. And so the concentration of investigation and money was in Colorado and Utah. Well, I couldn't see it that way because we had found bones in the Powder River Basin that were radioactive. So I prevailed on the survey to let me use a DC-3 old bomber to with a magnetometer bomb out on 100 yards of cable and a scintillator which recorded radioactivity, to fly several traverses across the Powder River Basin. And we got several big kicks on the scintillator and went out in the field in October, and we found a single, what we call a uranium roll. It's a round tube-like deposit of uranium, and it ran 15% uranium, which was extraordinary. And it was so of such national importance that in 2 weeks I had written a report and had it printed on this. And the Atomic Energy Commission and the people who in the survey who had different ideas got a committee together to go out and see how much I was lying. Well, we found about 8 more deposits there, and they became, years to come, uranium mines. So that was one part of the story. As soon as the word got out and the uranium boom there started and people were harassing the ranchers and staking claims everywhere regardless of the ownership, one company offered me $1 million to head it up and to leave the survey. At that time, I was making about $8,000 a year and had 4 little children. And so there was a temptation to make the big bucks. But
you didn't. Why? Why did you? How did you make that choice? $1 million in what 1950 or late 40s? What?
1954.
You turned down $1 million to continue your work, which you loved.
And a Scotchman doing that. No, it was a temptation, yes. But other things were more important. How big was this going to be? Were there other places? What challenges were left in uranium and other associated minerals, or the principles of ore finding? All those things were involved in the decision to go where the adventure was and not where the big bucks were.
As a scientist, I know that throughout your life, one of the dilemmas you've faced is that sometimes you discover things that lead to repercussions that you weren't expecting. One of the big areas was in the Gas Hills, really not very far from where your ranch was. When you go out and you look at that landscape, what are your feelings about that?
I wonder if I was right in finding uranium and going on with the research necessary to determine why it is where it is in the world. Is that a public service, or is it something that will be misused by countries and by people to create kingdoms that will enslave other parts of the world? I'm not sure what I did was a public service or a detriment.
Well, you even discovered oil in Yellowstone, and you made the choice to let that be known.
Yes, I wrote a paper on oil in Yellowstone. We were not allowed to use that title. We had to call it hydrocarbons in thermal areas.
So no one would notice that this had been discovered.
But it has been, that study has been expanded, and it's very useful in determining how oil can occur in volcanic rocks. And can it be used to, can these floods of oil that come out on the walls of Yellowstone Canyon be used as indicators of past and perhaps future seismic activity? Does the oil get squeezed out of the canyon walls by earthquakes? Things like that. So there are other uses for the information than saying we get so many barrels of oil out of this kind of rock.
When you think about your unique upbringing, your classical education, growing up in a place in which you were surrounded with geology and had plenty of time to think, do you think there could be a David Love today?
That's an interesting philosophical question. I think human beings can be adapted to anything. You don't have to be parallel to my bringing up. Some of the geologists I have known have come from big cities. Some of them were born with spoons in their mouths and never had to worry about money, and have become great people. I could name a few that I've worked with who were like that. And one of them in particular, his middle name was Carnegie. And he's used his money wisely and used it for the benefit of both economics and mankind. So I think anything is possible regardless of your background.
Thank you, Dr. Love, for sharing your home and your time with us.
Well, this has been a pleasure. It'll be interesting to see what the spin-off is.